Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Somewhere in Caracas, in the summer of 2018, a schoolteacher named Maria sat at her kitchen table and did the arithmetic one more time. She had been a teacher for 19 years. She taught history to children who were, in that particular moment of their country's life, living through the kind of history she had previously only read about in books. The kind of history that arrived not as dramatic events, but as the slow, grinding failure of ordinary things. The failure of the corner store to stock rice. The failure of the pharmacy to carry medicine. The failure of the number on her monthly paycheck to mean anything at all by the time the money arrived in her account. Her salary that month was 14 million bolivares. The number was precise and official and the product of a calculation made by people in a government building. The problem was that 14 million bolivares could not buy a kilogram of meat. It could not buy a liter of cooking oil. By the time she received it, the currency had lost somewhere between 97 and 99% of its value over the previous 12 months. The precise figure changed faster than anyone could measure it. This is not a story about numbers. Numbers cannot contain what happened in Venezuela between 2012 and 2023. They cannot contain the weight of the decision a parent made when choosing between feeding their children and paying for bus fare to a job that paid a salary worth less than $1 a day. They cannot contain the specific quality of humiliation that comes from a society's productive middle class. Its teachers, its doctors, its engineers, watching the fruits of decades of work dissolve as though they had never existed. But something happened in Venezuela during those years that turned out to matter far beyond Venezuela. Into an economy where the national currency had become effectively worthless, where the banking system was unreliable and the government was hostile to any alternative, a new kind of money arrived. It was not offered by any government. It was not backed by any central bank. It existed only in mathematics and in the distributed computers of people who had chosen, for various reasons, to run the software that maintained it. It was called Bitcoin, and then Ethereum, and then the dollar-pegged stablecoins that arrived later. And for millions of Venezuelans who had no other options, it worked. The story of how a country's economic collapse became the first large-scale, real-world test of cryptocurrency as a survival technology, and what that test revealed about both the technology and the limits of state power over money, is what the night holds. To understand what happened in Venezuela, you need to understand what Venezuela was. In 1970, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America. Its per capita income was higher than Spain's, higher than Greece's, competitive with much of Western Europe. The country sat above the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than 300 billion barrels, a geological inheritance so vast it had not yet been fully measured. The infrastructure of Caracas was modern. Its universities were respected across the region. Its professional class had the confidence of a society that believed its trajectory was upward. The oil was real, the revenue was real, and the prosperity, while unevenly distributed, was real enough to create the expectation that it would continue and deepen. The problem that oil wealth creates for a country is one that economists have studied extensively and named with clinical precision: the resource curse. When a country's economy is organized around extracting and selling a single commodity, the normal discipline that builds diverse economic capability simply doesn't develop. The exchange rate stays high because oil revenue flows in and inflates the currency, making other exports uncompetitive. The government collects the commodity revenue directly, which means it doesn't need to tax citizens. And a government that doesn't need to tax citizens has less incentive to respond to citizens' needs. The bureaucracy expands. The private sector outside of oil either shrinks or becomes dependent on government contracts. Over time, the capacity to produce things other than oil atrophies. The entire society becomes structurally dependent on oil prices it cannot control. Venezuela had been living with the resource curse for decades before Hugo Chavez was elected president in 1998. What Chavez did was not create the underlying fragility. It was already there. What he did was make choices about how to use the oil revenue that accelerated the fragility while distributing enough of the proceeds widely enough to maintain political support. The social programs he built, subsidized food, expanded health care, literacy campaigns, housing construction, were real and reached people who had previously been largely excluded from Venezuela's oil wealth. They were also funded by oil revenue in ways that created permanent spending obligations that could only be sustained as long as oil prices remained high. When oil was trading above $100 a barrel, as it was through much of the 2000s, the system generated enormous receipts. The government spent generously. Poverty rates fell. Chavez's approval ratings remained high. But underneath the generosity, the productive capacity of the economy outside oil continued to contract. Private businesses operated in an environment of regulatory uncertainty and currency controls that made planning nearly impossible. The agricultural sector, which had fed Venezuela for centuries, had been disrupted by land redistribution programs that transferred property without transferring the expertise and capital to work it productively. The manufacturing base shrank, the import bill grew, and the entire structure held together only as long as oil prices remained elevated. Oil prices did not remain elevated forever. They never do. When the global oil price fell sharply in 2014, Venezuela was exposed in a way that had no painless remedy. The government under Nicolás Maduro, who had succeeded Chavez after his death in 2013, responded not with structural adjustment, but with the printing of currency to maintain spending. When inflation followed, the response was price controls, which produced shortages. When shortages produced black markets, the response was enforcement, which produced scarcity and corruption simultaneously. Each intervention created the conditions that made the next intervention feel necessary, and the spiral tightened with each turn. By 2016, inflation was running at several 100% annually. By 2018, it had reached figures that required new vocabulary. Hyperinflation, a technical economic term for price increases exceeding 50% per month, had arrived, a rate at which money loses its basic function as a store of value so completely that people measure their wealth not in the local currency, but in the physical goods they can acquire before prices rise again. Venezuela's inflation in 2018 was eventually measured at approximately 1,700,000% annually. 1,700,000%. The number requires explanation, not because it is difficult to comprehend mathematically, but because the human reality it describes is so far outside the normal experience of economic difficulty that it requires translation into the concrete. A family that had saved the equivalent of $10,000 in bolivars at the beginning of 2017 held, by the end of 2018, the equivalent of $6.03. Not because of a market crash, not because of a bank failure, not because of any decision they made, but because the government whose currency they held had made decisions they had no power to influence and no mechanism to escape. The savings of a lifetime, the surplus of decades of work and sacrifice, dissolved not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the grinding, continuous process of a currency losing value so fast that the numbers on the bills became ceremonial objects rather than representations of anything real. The bolivar, Venezuela's national currency, had become a unit of measurement so unstable it was practically useless for anything beyond small day-to-day transactions conducted and completed within hours. The first Venezuelans who turned to cryptocurrency were not the poor. They were the technically sophisticated, the internationally connected, people who had heard about Bitcoin through online communities and recognized, before most of their compatriots, what the technology offered in an environment where the national currency was collapsing. They were programmers who understood the blockchain. They were young professionals with access to foreign contacts who could help them acquire Bitcoin through exchanges that operated outside Venezuela. They were members of the Venezuelan diaspora who had left for Colombia, Peru, the United States, Spain, and who began gradually to send money home not through Western Union or bank transfers, but through cryptocurrency. The fees were lower. The process didn't require navigating a Venezuelan banking system that was increasingly dysfunctional. And the recipient could hold the value in an asset that didn't lose 30% in a week. Local Bitcoins, a peer-to-peer Bitcoin trading platform that connected buyers and sellers directly without a centralized exchange, became the infrastructure through which much of Venezuela's early cryptocurrency adoption happened. The platform allowed someone in Caracas to find someone else in Caracas willing to trade Bitcoin for bolivars in person. The transaction didn't require a bank account. It didn't require government-approved channels. It didn't require trusting any institution that was subject to Venezuelan regulatory control. For a population increasingly unable to trust their banks, their currency, or their government's economic management, the peer-to-peer nature of the platform was not a technical detail. It was the entire point. What local Bitcoins and the peer-to-peer ecosystem it enabled represented, in the Venezuelan context, was not just a financial alternative. It was a shadow financial system that operated in parallel with the official system and was, in several practical dimensions, more functional for ordinary Venezuelans than the official one. The official system required bank accounts that were subject to government oversight and currency controls. The official system operated at exchange rates set by a government that had every political incentive to maintain fiction about the bolivar's value. The official system took days to process transfers that the blockchain settled in minutes. The peer-to-peer cryptocurrency economy had none of these limitations. It operated at real market exchange rates because it was a market. It settled in the time it took for a blockchain transaction to be confirmed. It required only a smartphone and an internet connection to access. The comparison was not abstract. For someone trying to preserve the value of a weekly salary against inflation that was running at several percent per day, the ability to convert bolivars to Bitcoin within minutes of receiving a paycheck was not a luxury. It was basic financial survival. The volume of local Bitcoins trading in Venezuela grew steadily through 2016 and 2017, then exploded in 2018 as the hyperinflation reached its most acute phase. Venezuela was consistently the second or third largest market on the platform by trading volume, behind only countries with populations many times larger. The adoption rate, measured as a fraction of the population actively using the platform, was among the highest in the world. A country of 30 million people, with average incomes measured in fractions of $1 per day, had become one of Bitcoin's most active trading environments. Not because Venezuelans were cryptocurrency enthusiasts, but because they were people in desperate need of something that worked. The human infrastructure of this economy was invisible to most outside observers. In every major Venezuelan city, there were people, usually young, usually technically literate, usually operating through mobile phones, who had become informal exchange brokers. They knew the current black market exchange rate. They knew the current Bitcoin price. They could calculate the conversion instantly. They charged a modest spread and completed the transaction in a cafe, a parking lot, a living room. Word of them spread through exactly the same channels through which all essential survival information spread in Venezuela during those years, through WhatsApp groups, through family networks, through the whispered recommendations of people who had found something that worked and wanted to share it with the people they cared about. The remittance story was its own parallel development. By 2018, somewhere between 3 and 5 million Venezuelans had emigrated, one of the largest proportional displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere outside of active war zones. These were not dramatic refugees. They were professionals who could no longer sustain their households on local wages. Families that left incrementally as individual members found opportunities abroad. Once outside Venezuela, they needed to send money home. The traditional remittance infrastructure, Western Union, MoneyGram, bank wire transfers, required receiving accounts in a functioning banking system, imposed fees that consumed meaningful fractions of transfers, and operated at exchange rates that bore no relationship to real market values. Cryptocurrency offered lower fees, faster settlement, and no requirement for the recipient to have a bank account. The diaspora adopted it not as ideology, but as logistics. What emerged through these channels and others was an informal cryptocurrency economy operating alongside the collapsing official economy. In cities and towns across Venezuela, small networks of people who knew someone who could exchange bolivars for Bitcoin provided liquidity that the banking system no longer reliably provided. The networks were informal. The exchanges were often in person. The record of each transaction existed on the blockchain and nowhere else. The government, for reasons both of ideology and incapacity, could not easily see or control what was happening. Nicolas Maduro's government was not indifferent to cryptocurrency. It was intensely interested in it, but for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the survival needs of its citizens. In December 2017, Maduro announced the creation of a cryptocurrency called the Petro. The Petro, he explained, would be backed by Venezuela's oil reserves. Each unit would represent a specific quantity of the country's petroleum. It would allow Venezuela to conduct international transactions in a currency that bypassed the US dollar and the financial sanctions that the United States had imposed on Venezuelan government officials and state entities. The Petro was, in Maduro's framing, an act of monetary sovereignty, a declaration that Venezuela could create its own digital currency and escape the dominance of the financial system that the United States controlled. He held a press conference surrounded by officials in military uniforms and announced that the Petro would raise billions of dollars for Venezuela's development, that it would demonstrate to the world that cryptocurrency technology could be used by sovereign nations to protect their economic independence, that Venezuela would lead the way. The Petro launched formally in February 2018. The government claimed it raised $5 billion in its pre-sale. Independent observers found this figure impossible to verify. Cryptocurrency analysts dismissed it as implausible. The Petro had no functioning blockchain that could be independently audited. Its published technical documentation, the white paper that was supposed to explain its architecture, was riddled with inconsistencies that any competent programmer would immediately identify. The wallet software required to hold it was not publicly available. The exchanges that were supposed to list it for trading did not list it. The international investment it was supposed to attract did not materialize. The United States Treasury issued specific guidance warning American citizens and companies against dealing in the Petro, characterizing it as a potential instrument for evading U.S. sanctions. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and every major cryptocurrency research organization that examined it reached the same conclusion. The Petro was not a functional cryptocurrency. It was a propaganda instrument, a way for the government to claim participation in the global cryptocurrency revolution, while the population it governed used real cryptocurrency to escape the consequences of the government's policies. The contrast was extraordinary. While Maduro held press conferences about the petro, millions of Venezuelans were using Bitcoin and USDT on their phones to do the actual work of surviving. Meanwhile, the government's attitude toward the cryptocurrency its citizens were actually using was hostility barely restrained by incapacity. The Central Bank of Venezuela issued statements warning against the use of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. The government periodically detained people found operating informal cryptocurrency exchanges, though the enforcement was inconsistent and often appeared to be a pretext for extortion rather than a coherent regulatory policy. There was a specific tension at the center of the government's cryptocurrency problem. The population was using Bitcoin and dollar-pegged stablecoins precisely because those assets held their value in a way that the bolivar did not. Every dollar equivalent held in cryptocurrency was a dollar equivalent that was not in bolivars, which meant it was, in a real sense, a vote of no confidence in the government's monetary management. The government could not simultaneously maintain the fiction that the bolivar was a functional currency and permit the open operation of markets where its citizens were actively choosing not to hold it. But it also lacked the technical and institutional capacity to actually prevent a sufficiently motivated population from using the internet to access decentralized financial networks. The attempt to redenominate the currency, replacing 100,000 old bolivars with one new sovereign bolivar in August 2018, illustrated the problem with perfect clarity. The redenomination was a bookkeeping operation. It removed zeros from the numbers without addressing any of the underlying causes of inflation. It did not reduce government spending. It did not change the money supply growth rate. It did not alter the structural conditions that produced inflation in the first place. The new currency lost 50% of its value in the first week after introduction. The people who had converted their savings to Bitcoin before the redenomination had preserved their wealth. The people who had trusted the new currency had not. The lesson did not need to be articulated. It was experienced. The electricity subsidy was the detail that made Venezuela's cryptocurrency story unlike anywhere else in the world. For decades, Venezuela had subsidized electricity so heavily that residential power was effectively free for most consumers. The subsidy was a product of the same oil revenue logic that had distorted the rest of the economy. The government used oil income to provide cheap or free basic services as a form of political patronage, which created constituencies that depended on the subsidy and resisted its removal. The result, by the late 2010s, was an electricity sector that was deeply dysfunctional, infrastructure that hadn't been adequately maintained, a grid that experienced regular blackouts, and power that, when it was available, cost almost nothing for the consumer. For Bitcoin miners, free electricity was not just an advantage. It was a structural transformation of the economics of mining. The cost of electricity is the primary variable operating expense in cryptocurrency mining. It is the number that determines whether a mining operation is profitable or not at any given Bitcoin price. A mining operation running on zero-cost electricity had a structural cost advantage over every mining operation anywhere else in the world. In the United States, where electricity was expensive, mining Bitcoin required the price of Bitcoin to be high enough to cover costs, and when prices fell sharply, as they did in 2018, operations became unprofitable and miners shut down. In Venezuela, where electricity was free, mining Bitcoin required the price of Bitcoin to simply be greater than zero. Even during the bear markets of 2018 and 2019, when Bitcoin's price had fallen 80% from its peak, and miners in high-cost countries were shutting down equipment and selling operations, Venezuelan miners were profitable. Every Bitcoin they mined cost them essentially nothing to produce. The mining operations that emerged in Venezuela ranged from individuals running a few graphics cards in their apartments to larger operations assembled by people with access to commercial space and the technical knowledge to scale. A young engineer in Caracas might start with 2 graphics cards purchased secondhand, running in a spare room, consuming electricity that cost him nothing, generating Bitcoin that he could exchange for dollars. An entrepreneur with capital might acquire 10 or 20 ASIC mining machines, specialized hardware designed specifically for Bitcoin mining, and set them up in a warehouse or a repurposed commercial building, drawing hundreds of kilowatts of subsidized power. They were, almost universally, operating outside any legal framework that had given them permission. The government had not authorized private Bitcoin mining. The electricity subsidy was technically intended for residential consumers. The people running miners were diverting subsidized electricity to generate a cryptocurrency the government had declared hostile to its monetary system. The enforcement response was unpredictable in ways that shaped behavior. Some miners were arrested. Their equipment was seized. They faced charges of electricity theft, fraud, and in some cases money laundering. Others paid bribes to local police or officials from the electricity authority, small regular payments that purchased immunity, or at least advance warning of inspections. Still others operated in the gaps, visible to anyone who looked, but below the threshold of whatever official attention was currently directed elsewhere. The inconsistency of enforcement was itself a form of information. It told people that the prohibition was not serious, that the real concern was not compliance but revenue extraction, that the system could be navigated, that the informal economy and the cryptocurrency economy ran on the same operational logic. Everything was permitted that was also paid for. The economics of the Venezuelan mining environment were not lost on the international cryptocurrency mining industry, which observed Venezuela's situation with a mixture of fascination and frustrated envy. Mining operators in the United States, Canada, Iceland, and China, who were competing on the basis of electricity cost, which represented their primary variable expense, were operating at electricity prices ranging from 3 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. Venezuelan miners were operating at effectively zero. The structural cost advantage this created was so dramatic that it made Venezuelan mining profitable at Bitcoin price levels, where every mining operation elsewhere in the world was losing money. During the 2018 bear market, when Bitcoin fell from nearly $20,000 to below $4,000, mining operations worldwide in the hundreds, unable to cover electricity costs at those prices. Venezuelan miners kept running. They had no electricity costs to cover. Every Bitcoin they mined at any price was profit. The irony of Venezuela's situation was complete. A government that had destroyed its economy's productive capacity so thoroughly that it gave away electricity for free had inadvertently created the most favorable Bitcoin mining environment on Earth. By 2019 and 2020, Venezuela had developed what researchers and journalists who visited the country described as one of the most extensive grassroots cryptocurrency ecosystems in the world. It was not organized, not regulated, not endorsed by any government institution. It was a distributed network of individuals who had learned, through necessity, how to use decentralized financial tools for the practical purposes of storing value, sending money, and conducting transactions in a currency that held its value from one day to the next. The knowledge spread through family networks, through online communities, through the kind of practical peer-to-peer education that happens when people realize they need to learn something to survive. A father taught his daughter how to set up a wallet. A programmer in a Caracas office explained to his colleagues how to receive payment for freelance work in USDT. A community leader in a Maracaibo neighborhood organized an informal workshop in someone's living room on folding chairs to explain how to send and receive stablecoins. The knowledge moved the way all essential survival knowledge moves, person to person, through trust. The stablecoin was the development that changed the practical reality of cryptocurrency use in Venezuela more than anything else. Bitcoin's volatility had always been a genuine barrier to its use as a practical medium of exchange or store of value for people living on small, irregular incomes. A teacher who converted her salary to Bitcoin in a week when Bitcoin fell 30% had not preserved her wealth. She had created a different kind of risk. Bitcoin as a store of value made sense over long-time horizons and for people who could absorb short-term losses. Bitcoin as a practical survival tool for someone who needed to buy food in the next 3 days was a more complicated proposition. The volatility that made Bitcoin exciting as an investment made it dangerous as the primary store of value for a household with no financial cushion. Dollar-pegged stablecoins, most notably Tether, known as USDT, and later USD Coin, known as USDC, addressed this problem directly. They maintained a one-to-one peg with the US dollar while existing on the same blockchain infrastructure that made Bitcoin transferable and accessible without banks. For a Venezuelan who could not open a US dollar bank account, could not legally hold significant dollar cash under currency control regulations, and whose bolivar savings were evaporating, a stablecoin that held its value in dollar terms could be sent across the blockchain in minutes and could be held in a digital wallet on a phone represented something genuinely new. Access to dollar stability without access to the U.S. financial system. The simplicity of the value proposition, 1 USDT equals $1 today, tomorrow, and next month, was exactly what the volatile national currency could not provide. The stablecoin infrastructure that enabled this came from outside Venezuela, from development teams in the United States and elsewhere who had built Tether, USDC, and other dollar-pegged tokens for reasons entirely unrelated to Venezuelan hyperinflation. The convergence between the technology's capabilities and Venezuela's specific needs was not designed. It was discovered by millions of Venezuelans who needed dollar stability and found it, by various routes, in digital assets that happened to be accessible on the same phones they already owned. This accidental fit between a technology built for one purpose and a population with a completely different need is one of the more striking features of the Venezuelan story. A reminder that the real-world applications of a new technology are often not the ones its creators anticipated. The inventors of Tether were not thinking about Venezuelan school teachers. The Venezuelan school teachers who used Tether to preserve their salaries were solving a problem the technology's inventors had not specified it for. The blockchain did not know it was operating in Venezuela. It operated the same way everywhere, as it was designed to do, and the people who needed its properties most urgently found it and used it. The adoption of stablecoins in Venezuela accelerated through 2020 and 2021. Chainalysis, the blockchain analytics company, published annual reports on global cryptocurrency adoption that placed Venezuela consistently in the top 5 countries worldwide by their adoption index, adjusted for purchasing power and population. The methodology was imperfect, as all such measurements are. But the direction was clear. Venezuela was one of the places on Earth where cryptocurrency adoption was deepest, most widespread, and most directly tied to practical economic need rather than speculative interest. The use cases that developed were specific and practical. Freelancers who provided services to international clients, writing, software development, graphic design, customer service, requested payment in USDT because it arrived without the transaction costs and delays of international wire transfers, and without conversion into bolivars at official exchange rates that bore no relationship to real market values. Merchants in some neighborhoods of Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia began displaying prices in dollars and accepting cryptocurrency payments. effectively dollarizing their pricing through a combination of stablecoins and informal conversion. A restaurant owner might show prices in dollars on a handwritten sign, accept payment in USDT, convert a portion to bolivars as needed for small local purchases, hold the rest in stablecoins as protection against the inflation that would otherwise erode any bolivar balance overnight. Families who had relatives abroad received stablecoin transfers that preserved full dollar value, rather than the fraction that survived Western Union fees and unfavorable exchange rates. A remittance of $100 sent through traditional channels might arrive as the equivalent of $60 or $70 after fees and exchange rate conversion. Sent as USDT, the recipient received the equivalent of $97 or $98. The difference was not theoretical. For families operating on the margins, it was a meaningful fraction of their monthly income. What happened to Maria, the school teacher, and to the millions of Venezuelans in similar positions was a slow-motion catastrophe measured in the granular details of daily survival. The statistics that described Venezuela's economic collapse between 2014 and 2021 were staggering in aggregate. GDP fell by more than 70% over 7 years, a contraction larger than the United States experienced during the Great Depression. The poverty rate, measured by the standard of having insufficient income to meet basic nutritional needs, reached 80% of the population by 2019. Life expectancy fell. Child malnutrition increased. The medical system, which had been genuinely functional in the 1980s, deteriorated to the point where basic medications were unavailable. Hospitals operated without reliable electricity or running water. Medical procedures that would be routine anywhere else in Latin America required traveling to Colombia or Panama and paying in foreign currency. Doctors who had trained in Venezuela's universities emigrated at a rate that hollowed out the healthcare system. Engineers left. Professors left. The knowledge workers who were most capable of rebuilding the economy were precisely the people most capable of leaving it. By 2019, Venezuela had lost somewhere between 10 and 15% of its total population to emigration. In terms of skilled labor, the losses were proportionally even larger. The immigration crisis that ran alongside the economic collapse was itself a driver of cryptocurrency adoption in ways that are underappreciated in accounts that focus on the domestic Venezuelan experience. The roughly 5 million Venezuelans who had left the country by 2021, settling in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, the United States, Spain, and dozens of other destinations, were connected to family members remaining in Venezuela by bonds that the economic crisis had not severed, but had made financially complicated. A son working in Lima, sending a portion of his earnings home to a mother in Caracas, faced a stark choice: traditional remittance channels that were expensive, slow, and subject to exchange rate manipulation, or cryptocurrency that arrived within minutes, cost a fraction of a percent in fees, and landed in the recipient's wallet at real market value, rather than the official rate that bore no relationship to what bolivars would actually buy. The choice was not difficult. The adoption of cryptocurrency by the Venezuelan diaspora was driven by exactly the same logic as the adoption within Venezuela itself. It was the best available option for a specific practical problem. But it created a distribution mechanism that brought cryptocurrency into Venezuelan households through the remittance channel, which was often the first exposure many families had to the technology. In the middle of this collapse, the people who had access to cryptocurrency occupied a materially different position than those who did not. The difference was not the comfortable privilege of an investment gain. It was the difference between having something to eat and not having something to eat, between being able to buy the medicine that existed somewhere in the black market and not being able to buy it, between being able to pay for a child's school supplies and not being able to pay for them. The specific human geography of cryptocurrency adoption in Venezuela reflected the geography of information access and social connection. People who had relatives abroad were more likely to have cryptocurrency because remittances drove adoption. People in cities were more likely to have cryptocurrency than people in rural areas because the informal exchange networks were more developed in urban environments. People with smartphones and reliable internet access, themselves markers of relative advantage, were more likely to have cryptocurrency than those without. The technology was accessible to a broad range of people compared to formal financial systems, but it was not equally accessible to everyone. The people at the bottom of the economic ladder were often the last to benefit from it. The broader population that lacked cryptocurrency access found other coping mechanisms. The informal dollarization of the economy, conducting transactions in physical US dollars obtained through whatever channels were available, predated widespread cryptocurrency adoption and continued alongside it. Barter economies developed in some regions. People grew food in urban gardens. Extended family networks pooled resources in ways that recalled economic arrangements from before the oil wealth had arrived. The resilience that emerged was real, but it was the resilience of people with no other options. And it came at costs, in time, in dignity, in the permanent damage done to human capital by years of malnutrition and interrupted education and foregone professional development that would not appear in any economic statistic. The children who grew up in Venezuela during the worst years of the crisis are carrying those costs in ways that will take decades to fully appear. By 2021, something unexpected had happened in Venezuela. The acute phase of the hyperinflation appeared to have passed. The inflation rate remained extremely high by any normal standard, but the million% figures of 2018 were not repeating. The economy had undergone a painful, informal, largely unacknowledged dollarization. Most significant transactions, real estate, cars, professional services, restaurant meals, retail goods in established shops were priced in US dollars rather than bolivars. The bolivar had become, in practice, a currency for small day-to-day transactions. The government had not formally abandoned the bolivar or formally dollarized, but it had essentially stopped enforcing the currency controls that had previously required transactions to occur in bolivars at official rates. The black market had become the market. The informal had become the norm. The process by which this informal dollarization occurred, through millions of individual decisions rather than any policy announcement, was itself a form of democratic monetary reform. No government body voted on it. No legislature passed a law. No central bank announced a change of policy. The citizens of Venezuela, confronted with a currency that had stopped functioning, simply chose different currencies through their daily transactions, and their collective choice accumulated into a structural transformation of the monetary landscape. The government's periodic attempts to reassert bolivar usage through regulation and enforcement were ineffective not because the government lacked the will to enforce them, but because the population had too broadly adopted the alternatives for consistent enforcement to be feasible. By 2021, Venezuelan taxi drivers were listing fares in dollars. Venezuelan landlords were setting rents in dollars. Venezuelan employers in the private sector were paying salaries partly in dollars and partly in cryptocurrency. The bolivar remained the official currency, required for tax payments and official transactions, but the real economy had moved to something else. The state's monetary authority had been reduced, through the accumulated weight of individual choices, to a largely ceremonial function. The dollarization that cryptocurrency had helped facilitate was one channel of a broader process in which the US dollar had effectively replaced the bolivar as Venezuela's functional currency through spontaneous market behavior rather than government policy. This was a form of monetary stability, but it was purchased at an enormous cost: the complete destruction of the national currency and the wealth denominated in it. The effective exclusion of the large portion of the population that operated primarily in bolivars from any meaningful store of value. The creation of a two-tier economy in which dollar holders and bolivar holders lived in materially different economic realities. A pensioner whose retirement savings had been in bolivars was poor in a way that was structurally different from someone whose savings had been in dollars or stablecoins. The cryptocurrency infrastructure that had developed during the crisis remained in place and continued to develop through 2021 and 2022. Venezuelan freelancers who worked remotely for international employers had established payment channels in cryptocurrency that they continued to use. The remittance networks that used stablecoins continued operating. The miners who had survived the variable enforcement of prohibition continued mining. New miners entered the market. New exchange platforms, both local and international, added Venezuelan users. The knowledge of how to use digital wallets, how to trade peer-to-peer, how to convert between cryptocurrency and local currency, that knowledge, once distributed, did not disappear. Venezuela had built, through necessity, a cryptocurrency literacy that was embedded in its population in a way that no marketing campaign or government initiative could have produced. It was the literacy of people who had learned because they had no other choice. And it was durable. The government's 2020 regulatory framework for cryptocurrency, which attempted to formally license and tax cryptocurrency transactions that had previously operated entirely outside official oversight, represented an acknowledgement, however grudging, that the informal cryptocurrency economy could not be prohibited out of existence. The framework was imperfectly enforced and widely evaded, but its existence marked a transition from the earlier period of outright hostility to a posture of uneasy coexistence. Cryptocurrency exchanges that registered under the new framework could operate with a degree of official tolerance that their informal predecessors had not enjoyed. The tax revenue the government hoped to extract from the licensed exchanges was modest. Most cryptocurrency activity remained off the official radar, but the framework's existence signaled that the government had accepted, at some level, that it needed to accommodate the technology rather than confront it. This accommodation was forced by the reality that its own population had already made the choice for it. The government was not leading the monetary transformation of Venezuela's economy. It was following, belatedly and reluctantly, the choices its citizens had already made. The researchers who studied Venezuela's cryptocurrency adoption came from a variety of disciplines and arrived with a variety of questions. Economists wanted to understand whether cryptocurrency had actually functioned as a store of value in the way its proponents claimed, and whether access to it had materially affected economic outcomes for households. The preliminary research suggested yes, access to cryptocurrency, particularly to dollar-pegged stablecoins, was associated with meaningfully better economic outcomes for Venezuelan households during the acute hyperinflation period. The causal direction was complicated by the fact that the same factors giving households cryptocurrency access also predicted better outcomes for other reasons. But the direction of the effect was consistent across multiple methodologies. Political scientists wanted to understand what the widespread adoption of non-state currency implied for the relationship between citizens and their government's monetary authority. The Venezuelan case was the most extensive real-world example of what happened when a significant portion of a population opted out of the national currency, not through formal policy, not through legal dollarization, but through the accumulated individual decisions of millions of people choosing to hold an asset their government could not control. The government had not collapsed. The bolivar had not been formally abolished. The political system had not changed. But the monetary sovereignty that governments assumed was one of their unassailable prerogatives had been eroded, practically and at scale, by people with smartphones and internet access. Human rights researchers documented the ways that cryptocurrency had provided practical protection for specific categories of people whose financial activities were subject to government surveillance or control. Opposition politicians who had had their bank accounts frozen used cryptocurrency to receive donations and pay expenses. Journalists whose advertising revenue had been suspended by government pressure on local businesses used cryptocurrency payment channels to continue operating. Civil society organizations that had been officially deregistered by a government seeking to suppress dissent continued receiving cryptocurrency donations from international supporters. In each case, the relevant property of cryptocurrency was not its investment potential. It was its resistance to unilateral seizure by a government that controlled the banking system. The blockchain analytics firms that studied Venezuela's on-chain activity produced a specific finding with implications beyond Venezuela. Peer-to-peer trading volume on platforms like local bitcoins tracked the bolivar's depreciation with remarkable fidelity. When the bolivar lost value rapidly, peer-to-peer Bitcoin trading volume in Venezuela spiked within hours. When the rate of depreciation slowed, volume moderated. The blockchain was, in this sense, a real-time economic sensor, a record of how many people were choosing, at any given moment, to convert bolivars to something else. It was a measurement of loss of confidence in a national currency, visible in near real time, that no government statistical office would have published, and that no traditional economic data source could have produced with such immediacy. The Chainalysis Global Cryptocurrency Adoption Index, published annually, consistently placed Venezuela among the top 5 countries in the world by the metrics it tracked. The methodology counted only on-chain activity. It could not count the full scope of Venezuela's cryptocurrency economy because much of it happened off-chain, in peer-to-peer transactions settled in cryptocurrency but not necessarily broadcast on public networks. The measured figure was likely a significant undercount. The true adoption, if it could be fully measured, was probably larger than anything the data showed. What Venezuela demonstrated, at a scale and specificity that no theoretical argument could have achieved, was a set of propositions about cryptocurrency that had previously existed primarily as claims. The first proposition was that people in genuine economic distress would use cryptocurrency as a practical financial tool when it was the best available option, not because they were ideologically committed to decentralization, not because they had speculated on its price and made money, but because it solved a problem that nothing else solved. The Venezuelan adoption was bottom-up, necessity-driven, and indifferent to the political debates about cryptocurrency's legitimacy or its relationship to existing financial systems. People used it because it worked, and in doing so they demonstrated that the technology's usefulness extended beyond the wealthy, the technically sophisticated, and the ideologically motivated. The second proposition was about the limits of state control over digital currency. The Venezuelan government had tried, with varying levels of seriousness, to prohibit or control the use of non-state cryptocurrency for years. It had failed. Not because its security services were incompetent, but because the technology was designed to resist exactly the kind of centralized interdiction that a government could deploy against a bank or a currency exchange. The government could arrest individual miners and traders. It could not arrest the network. It could seize individual wallets if it knew about them. It could not seize value held in a wallet to which only the holder had the private key. The confrontation between state monetary authority and decentralized cryptocurrency, played out in Venezuela at population scale, ended in a practical stalemate that looked, from most angles, more like cryptocurrency's persistence than the government's victory. The third proposition was about remittances and financial inclusion. The combination of smartphone penetration, relatively low barriers to cryptocurrency wallet creation, and the peer-to-peer networks providing liquidity for conversion between cryptocurrency and local currency had produced a functional alternative to the formal remittance infrastructure for a significant portion of the diaspora. The money that flowed into Venezuela through cryptocurrency channels carried less cost, settled faster, and required less institutional infrastructure than the money that flowed through traditional channels. For a country where remittances had become one of the primary sources of foreign currency, the practical demonstration that cryptocurrency could serve this function reliably and at scale had implications that extended to every other remittance corridor in the world, to the Filipino workers in the Gulf, to the Mexican migrants in the United States, to the Bangladeshi garment workers in Malaysia who send a fraction of every paycheck home. The fourth proposition was about inequality. Cryptocurrency had not saved everyone. It had not saved the majority. It had provided meaningful help to the portion of the population with the connections, the technical literacy, and the device access to use it. A portion that was better positioned than the most vulnerable, even if it included large numbers of people who were genuinely poor by global standards. The technology's promise of financial inclusion for the unbanked had been partially validated in Venezuela, but it had also illustrated that access to digital financial tools was itself a form of privilege, whose distribution closely tracked the distribution of other forms of advantage. The people who needed help the most were often the last to receive it. And the fifth proposition, the one that may matter most in the long arc of the story, was about what becomes possible when a population learns under pressure that money does not have to come from a government. That value does not have to be stored in a form that a state can inflate or confiscate. That there exists now a technology that can hold purchasing power across borders and across crises. The Venezuelan case also produced a significant contribution to the academic and policy literature on cryptocurrency that influenced how regulators and development organizations thought about digital assets in developing economies. Papers published by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank's development research arm, and multiple academic economics departments used Venezuela as the primary case study when examining the relationship between monetary crisis and cryptocurrency adoption. The finding that ran consistently across this literature was that cryptocurrency adoption in Venezuela was not primarily speculative. It was not driven by the desire for investment gains, but utilitarian, driven by the specific practical properties of the technology. Its resistance to inflation, its accessibility without bank accounts, its ability to cross borders without the friction of formal financial systems. This finding was significant because it represented the first large-scale empirical evidence that cryptocurrency's real-world utility, as distinct from its investment appeal, could drive adoption at population scale. It changed how development economists thought about the technology and contributed to the policy shift, visible in the years that followed, toward treating cryptocurrency as a legitimate financial tool for developing economies, rather than exclusively as a speculative asset for wealthy investors. The specific lesson of the Venezuelan case is not that Bitcoin solved Venezuela's problems. It did not solve them. Venezuela's problems were political and structural and deeply human. No technology was going to fix the choices made by governments over decades, or undo the damage done to the institutions and the people and the productive capacity that those choices destroyed. What cryptocurrency offered was narrower and more specific than that. It offered a way for individuals to protect a fraction of their wealth from the consequences of choices they had no power to prevent. It offered a channel for families to remain financially connected across borders when the official channels were broken or captured. It offered, for some people in some circumstances, a floor beneath which their economic situation could not fall, a last resort with real utility. The Venezuelan case also reshaped the conversation about cryptocurrency regulation in a way that had lasting effects on the policy environment. Before Venezuela's cryptocurrency adoption became widely documented, the dominant framing in regulatory discussions was that cryptocurrency was primarily a tool for speculation and secondarily for criminal activity, and that regulation should focus on protecting speculators from fraud and preventing criminal use. The Venezuelan evidence introduced a third category that this framing had not accommodated: cryptocurrency as a survival tool for people whose governments had failed them. This category complicated the regulatory calculus in ways that were uncomfortable for regulators in stable economies whose populations had no comparable experience. The argument that cryptocurrency was dangerous because it was outside government control looked different when the relevant government was the Maduro administration, and when the population that had chosen to operate outside its control had done so to survive. The Venezuelan experience became a recurring reference point in regulatory debates, invoked by cryptocurrency advocates whenever discussions turned to the wisdom of restricting access to decentralized financial tools. It did not resolve those debates, but it introduced an empirical reality that pure theory could not easily dismiss. That is a modest claim. But modest claims, proven under conditions of genuine emergency, by millions of real people making real decisions with real money, are worth more than grand theoretical promises. Close your eyes one more time. In the summer of 2018, Maria, the schoolteacher, did the arithmetic again. Her salary was worthless by any standard she had previously used to measure worthlessness. Somewhere in her social network, a cousin, a former student, a neighbor, someone had explained to her how to download a wallet, how to find someone who would exchange bolivars for a small amount of Bitcoin, how to hold something whose value the government could not erode overnight. The learning curve was real, the friction was real, the risk was real. She is not a representative figure. She is one person, in one city, in one network of relationships that happened to include someone with the knowledge she needed. Millions of Venezuelans in similar positions did not have that person in their network. They found other ways to survive, or they didn't survive. Not in the sense of dying, though some did, but in the sense of emigrating, of watching their professional lives dissolve, of accepting that the life they had built had been taken from them by forces they could not name or contest. The global cryptocurrency community that watched Venezuela's adoption unfold through blockchain data and journalistic accounts was changed by what it saw. The dominant narrative about Bitcoin before Venezuela had been, in most mainstream discourse, speculative. A story about price movements, about early adopters who became wealthy, about the volatility that made it alternately exciting and alarming as an investment. Venezuela introduced a different narrative track, a story about utility, about a technology doing something that the people who needed it most found no other way to do. This narrative was more powerful in some dimensions than the investment story because it was harder to dismiss. Skeptics could argue that speculative prices were a bubble. They could not easily argue that a Venezuelan teacher using cryptocurrency to preserve a week's salary from a 30% overnight devaluation was engaged in a bubble. The use case was straightforwardly legitimate. The technology was doing something genuine. The people using it were not gamblers or ideologues. They were a teacher in Caracas, a nurse in Maracaibo, a mechanic in Valencia who had run out of options. That image, replicated millions of times, altered the terms of the debate about what cryptocurrency was and what it was for. What Venezuela added to the world's understanding of cryptocurrency was something that years of theoretical argument, academic debate, and investment speculation had not produced. Evidence. Evidence that when a national currency fails completely, when a banking system becomes unreliable, when a government loses the consent of its population in monetary affairs, there is now a technology that can fill some of the gap, not all of the gap, not equally, not without its own risks and limitations and costs, but something. In the long history of monetary failures, the Weimar Republic's hyperinflation, Zimbabwe's currency collapse, Argentina's recurring crises, the people caught inside those failures had few options. They could convert savings to physical dollars if they could get them. They could buy gold if they could store it. They could trust their government's promise of reform and be disappointed. They could emigrate if they could afford to. What they could not do was access, from a phone, a global network of value that no single government controlled. That option now exists. Venezuela was the first country to stress test it at population scale, under conditions of genuine emergency, against a government actively hostile to its use. The network survived. The people who used it were better off for using it. The government's monetary monopoly was broken, not by policy or revolution, but by millions of individual decisions made by people who had run out of alternatives. Sleep now. The network is still running. The wallets are still accessible. The blockchain still records every transaction in its patient, immutable ledger. The technology that Venezuelans found when they ran out of options is still there, waiting for the next population that runs out of options. And there will be one, somewhere, because currency failures and monetary crises and governments that print money they do not have are not unique to Venezuela. They are a recurring feature of human economic history. The technology is now part of the toolkit available to the people caught inside the next one. Let the numbers drift away. The 1,000,000% inflation, the 70% GDP collapse, the 5 million who left. They are the context for something smaller and more human. One teacher at a kitchen table, doing arithmetic that didn't add up, finding a different way to count, finding in the mathematics a way through. That is what the night. Breathe slowly. Let the arithmetic rest. Let the numbers settle into the silence where they belong. Let it be quiet. Story end.